Hello and welcome to our fourth session at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, our third international conference on Islamophobia. My name is Awais Khan. I am a senior research associate at the center. I want to welcome everybody. I will first begin by introducing the chair of this session, Dr. AbdulFattah Mohamed. He is based at the Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. Professor AbdulFattah has been working for more than 26 years in various international organizations as a consultant and also as an applied activist, applied ethicist. He has adopted an interdisciplinary approach in solving violent extremism, conflicts, and global international conflicts. He has been a consultant to many universities, governments, NGOs, including the OIC, Islamic Development Bank, and many others. He holds a PhD in politics from the University of Sheffield. Dr. AbdulFattah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Awais. I had the pleasure to join you today with this distinguished group of panelists, and I will introduce by saying that after the horrific events, the terrorist attacks in New York and Washington, the world has witnessed a new order called the global war on terror. And of course, this global war on terror has shaped the agendas, the policies, locally, regionally, and of course, globally. And we have seen a number of legislations, measures that has been directed to minorities in number of countries. Almost many countries have been affected by the global war on terror. And somehow this global war on terror has made a division between basically governments, states, and a specific minority or specific groups of people who have a specific religion. And we have seen this prevalence of the policies that persecuted Muslims in a specific cases, that some of those cases have been elaborated in the last few days in detail, that I don't need to repeat what the participants and the speakers have talked about. The problem of the global war on terror that has an impact on many governments, basically, where such paradigm, such new world order has shaped as well repressive regimes and dictators, where they securitize their opponents, their oppositions, you can say, in number of countries. And we have witnessed that, basically. And even those who have seek to basically have their own determination of their own future in terms of conflict issues, conflict kind of, matters, issues, cases, then these repressive regimes and dictators have basically designated them as terrorists, in a way copying the U.S. policies and basically the U.S. policies in terms of seeing from that lens, are you with us? If you are not with us, so you are against us, as the divisive speech by President basically George W. Bush post the horrific events. And we have seen such globalization of the war on terror, such securitization crossing all borders, you can say. And we have seen the case of Kashmir has taken a new dimension, a new shape. Even though India probably after 9/11 wasn't as divisive as it is right now in terms of dealing with the Kashmir issue in the way that it has dealt, we have seen the Myanmar Rohingya as well minorities facing all violations of international law, of international humanitarian law, and all crimes against humanity. And we have seen, recently, the problem of the Uyghur Muslims that has been as well across the globe with what we have seen in terms of cleansing and in terms of basically changing this whole community and treating that whole community the way that they have treated that, and curtailing as well one of the phenomena of the post 9/11 climate and the global war on terror is curtailing the academic institutions, the things that we have seen in the US Campus Watch by Daniel Pipes and others. This has been going on as well across a number of countries and specifically in Europe. Today we have, as our program, we have a number of speakers, distinguished speakers who are going to basically highlight and elaborate further on the global war on terror in a number of cases, the case of Kashmir and the case of the Muslim Rohingya and the case of Uyghur as well. Hopefully they will highlight all these cases. And then of course we will go to the academic side to listen from those distinguished basically academics. Just to let you know, every speaker would have 20 minutes and he has to basically unmute before speaking. And of course, we will have a session for Q&A. Unfortunately, one of the speakers today, Professor Omer Kanat, is not with us due to family reasons and family issues. We pray Allah that everything would be fine with him. However, we have had a colleague from Zaim University to replace him, and there is a sister with us as well to basically answer in the Q&A, Sister Aiden, hopefully. Without further ado, I will start with basically Professor Rabia Aamir. And Professor Rabia Aamir, she is specialized in the area of literal English. And she is, of course, going to speak and to tell us about the case of Kashmir and to examine the global war on terror in terms of its challenges, policies, and consequences. Professor Rabia has been a distinguished speaker and of course has been participated in many conferences and has been writing. She is from National University of Modern Languages in Islamabad. Professor Rabia, the microphone is yours. Please unmute and start.
Assalamu alaikum. Let me know when if my screen is can you see the screen, please?
Yes, we can see the screen. I can see at least the screen.
Okay. So, Assalamu alaikum and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. An eco-post-colonial historiographic study for peace and justice. So I'm going to talk about this Islamophobia, global war on terror in the case of Kashmir. And to start with, I would quote Francis Bacon's sentence, the opening sentence of his essay of Truth, where he says, "What is truth?" said the jesting pilot, and would not stay for an answer. So this reminds us this sentence cannot be more true in the context of Indian unilateral, illegal, and unconstitutional revocation of Article 370 and 35A on August 5th, 2019. The world seems to have bought the narrative of global war on terror without looking for truth in the ready-made answers tabled out for it and without inquiring into the actual situation of Kashmir. 5th August 2019 is actually a fruition of the rhetoric of Islamophobia and not its beginning. When we see a well-prepared documentary launched on the same day with the title Kashmir, the Story, a full documentary on history on timeline of Kashmir. It is preceded and followed by a plethora of books and discussion platforms where some critics like Stephen Tankel from the comfort zone of a studio in Washington, D.C. are seen to be arguing a potential more Pulwamas, as he calls it, or Varshini's ambivalent argument about the need for democracy and yet questioning the very foundation of the special status of Kashmir. While the balanced approaches of historians and critics like Alistair Lamb, Victoria Schofield, Suvir Kaul, Sanjay Kak, Arundhati Roy, or Gautam Naulaka are pushed off stage from the mainstream modes of global knowledge platforms. For instance, the world may refer to the above mentioned documentary, as you can see on the screen also, but it would not marginalize the documentaries like Jashn-e Azadi by Sanjay Kak, and so critics like Chakravarti in an article as late as 21st March 2021 argues in favor of the need to watch this 2007 documentary Jashn-e Azadi again and again in order to better contextualize the situation. So this paper, focusing on the Islamophobia that has gone down in Kashmiri history, is an extension of my earlier paper entitled Empires of Kashmir and Recurring Pretext, a historiographical analysis. As also mentioned in that paper, there is a need to keep our facts up to date and need to foreground the marginalized knowledge that before the tribal invasion, as one historian puts it, before the tribal invasion, negotiations at high level were in progress over Kashmir's accession to India. So we come across this fact. It can be read from the perspective of Islamophobia and popularized term of global war or terror, or the lexicon of extremism or pre-crime that Dr. Asim was talking about yesterday. And it is this war on terror is being meted out to the Kashmiri Muslims throughout their history. So that paper, in that earlier paper also, besides exposing the myths of Gilgit-Baltistan area, it highlighted the fact that like other states of Hyderabad, Junagadh, and Kashmir as a state were more of an ally than actual British subjects of the British Indian government. We come across an Islamophobia in the early history of Kashmir when we see that Gulab Singh was not a ruler of Kashmir, but he was a ruler in Jammu and of Jammu, and had worked his way up to a general in Ranjit Singh's army. He was rewarded by the British for his treason of staying away from the war that the British had declared against Sikhs in 1846. So the British very conveniently sold Kashmir to him for 75 lakh rupees. Gulab Singh grabbed all the wealth that he could retrieve and promoted bigar, that is forced labor, in order to recover the paid price. A number of historians and other writers give reference of the book of a Srinagar-based British historian, Robert Thorpe, whose father was British and mother a Kashmiri woman. An excerpt from his book titled Kashmir Misgovernment brings forth the fallacy of the newly neologized phrase of global war on terror. It is actually Gulab Singh and his son Pratap Singh's war of terror, as I would call it, on the innocent Kashmiris as early as 1842. So Thorpe writes, and I quote, he says, none those who save such can fully realize the horrors. Patiently the Kashmiris toil onwards towards the drifting snow. Many encourage each other with words of hope, but strength departs and the wind paralyzes the sinews, and he goes on like this. So like any modern day hegemonic autocracy, Pratap Singh plans to silence Thorpe, and he is attacked with daggers on a winter morning of 1868. This brave writer dies at the age of only 30 years and is buried in Christian cemetery behind the Lal Chowk in Srinagar. This is one example of many of the war of terror in Kashmiri history that was used to silence the voice of truth. Gul Muhammad Wani, a professor of political science at the Kashmir University, also quotes an example from the same book in his article and of Robert Thorpe. He says, towards the people of Kashmir, we have committed wanton outrage, gross injustice, and an act of tyrannical oppression which violates every human honorable sentiment, which is opposed to the whole spirit of modern civilization, and is in direct opposition to every tenet of religion we profess. So he has also quoted Thorpe. So thus this Islamophobia is in the context of Kashmiri identity has long historical evidences due to which the Kashmiris have been reduced to adopt extreme measures of resistance to record their grievances. While Robert Thorpe was silenced by the son Pratap Singh, a very similar account of his father is regarded as atrocities of Dogara rule in a book, and G.T. Whitney's book is quoted here, where he says, an insurrection, he says, had taken place near the Punch against the authority of Gulab Singh. He had gone in person to suppress it and succeeded in doing so. Some of his prisoners were flayed alive under his own eye. He then ordered one or two of the skins to be stuffed with straw. The hands were stiffened and tied in an attitude of supplication. The corpse was then placed erect, and the head, which had been severed from the body, was reversed as it rested on the neck. The figure was planted by the wayside that passers-by might see it, and Gulab Singh called his son's attention to it and told to him to take lessons in the art of governing. So the marginalization and erasure in the quotes, as mentioned above, ensues a consequence of the economic expansion of the sale of the whale of Jammu and Kashmir to the Gulab Singh for 75 lakh rupees by Lord Lawrence in 1846. It puts a binding seal on the fate of hapless people of Kashmir who were sold along with the land. So historians have also written how Maharaja Pratap Singh's loss in 1889 was again made again by the British in favor of Dogra rule in 1921. So the trickle effect of all these autocratic rulers made a Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, concede to the Kashmiris at one point that Dogra government forced you to lead a subhuman existence. And he also declared that Kashmir is not a commodity or sale to be bartered. It has individual existence, and its people must be final arbiter of their future. Similarly, Gandhi is seen to be saying that the will of the Kashmiris should decide the fate of Jammu and Kashmir, and the sooner it was done, the better. Nehru and Gandhi's pseudo-proclamations are never meant to be materialized in the Islamophobic maneuvers that we have been witnessing and are witnessing even today in Kashmir. So the unconstitutional revocation of Article 370 and 35A by India on August 5th, 2019 is nothing but a recurring pattern of these traumatic scenes of death and torture which we witness in Kashmir history. This Islamophobia and the so-called war on terror is problematized by many writers and critics. Abdul Hakim, a pen name of the British-born writer, in his book Paradise on Fire, he elaborates on the new law, on the law of Jammu and Kashmir as distinct from Indian law, and the fact that India cannot claim Kashmir to be an integral part of India on legal grounds too. So he discusses how the law was maneuvered by different government officials to suit to their advantage. The atrocities of hand-picked rulers like Bakshi Ghulam Ahmad holding government from 1953 to 63, and the school teacher Sheikh Abdullah, who being prisoned to be disciplined, signs the Kashmir Accord in 1975 and renounces his demand for a plebiscite after he comes out of the prison. So the graphic details with statistical data, the reviling of all the assurances and promises of Hindu leaders like Gandhi and Nehru, the strictly confidential letters to Indira Gandhi in 1966, the shamelessly rigged elections except for 1977, the blatant disregard of UN Security Council resolutions to the extent that and even more, that L.K. Advani the former Home Minister, is seen to be personally supervising the demolition of the Babri Mosque on 6 December 1992 and calling it a Kashmir problem in 1995 are some examples of Islamophobia and Indian war of terror. The fact that, as you can see on the screen also, that Balbir Singh, one of the demolishers of the masjid, embraces Islam soon after in 1993 never becomes a common knowledge, and is also kind of Islamophobia of the media tabloids. Similarly, Arundhati Roy questions this post 9/11 frenzy, as she calls it, and the United States government's global gloating prematurely over its victory in Afghanistan and the ongoing Gujarat pogrom, as she calls it. She demands in clear-cut terms, and I quote, "Who crafted our collective conscience," she says, on the Parliament attack case? Could it have been the facts we glean in the paper, the films we saw on TV? So the hoax of Indian war on terror Kashmiri terror is exposed howsoever we see it, whether they are the atrocities of old colonial history of Gulab Singh or the present day extrajudicial murders of thousands of Kashmiri youth, the Shujat Bukharis, the Afzal Gurus, the parliament attacks, the Burhan Wanis, the 2019 Pulwama attack, and subsequent jailing of Kashmiri Nation on 5th August 2019. The pattern of Islamophobia and this war of terror is a blatant disregard to the eco-post-colonial space of Kashmir. This Islamophobia and war of terror seems to be forgetting an extremely important has never worked with the peaceful nature of this land. Even if we go back further back into the memory lane of this land, we see that even the great Indian emperor Ashoka, as you can see on the screen, on the top left corner, who founded the Sirinagri, the city of wealth, in around 250 BC on the outskirts of what is modern-day Srinagar, renounces violence after one bloody battle and becomes a Buddhist. Much later, and in the early 14th century, a Tibetan prince, Rinchana, a seeker of truth, becomes the ruler of Kashmir and wants to convert to Hinduism. But the Brahmin priest refused to convert him, unsure which caste Rinchana would have. So his Muslim friend Aamir, he tells him about Islam. He sleeps in his palace and to wake up to the Muslim call of prayer, and watches a Sufi, Bulbul Shah, whose mausoleum is on the screen, praying their morning prayer at the bank of River Jhelum. Rinchana goes to him, asks him questions, and once satisfied by the answer, embraces Islam. Around 50 years later, born in 1377, is Nuruddin Rishi, a mystic. He's initially mentored by Lal Shevari, who's commonly known as Lal Ded, a Brahman woman who, after much suffering at the hands of her in-laws, rebelled and became a mystic, preaching oneness of God and arguing against the ancient Hindu caste system. So later, Nuruddin Rishi, he meets Muhammad Hamadan, a Sufi from Iran, and both then focus on the social reform, being critical of both Orthodox Muslims, Muslim priests and the Brahmins for reducing religion to empty rituals. So these are the cosmopolitan and feminist features of this land, where Muslim saint is taught by a Brahmin woman. These myths of modern-day Islamophobia are busted when we come across a similar de facto account of Gilani's life. Gilani's young mind was also nourished in a multicultural and a multi-religious environment by his Hindu teacher, Master Nityanand, well-versed in Urdu, Arabic, Persian, and other languages. However, Gilani's wise and pragmatic approach to face the challenges with patience and perseverance, as the book quotes it, and was ill-used by Muslim puppet of a ruler like Sheikh Abdullah. Hakim graphically narrates how Abdullah's overtly secularized policies make him declare and his pledges for Pandit Nehru as early as in 1948 of bequeathing Kashmir to India and getting the reward of staying in power for bearing the demand for plebiscite. He narrates the Indian policies of subjecting inhuman and brutal torture to whosoever raises his voice against these betrayals. Sheikh Abdullah's soiled hand with the custodial killings is something which stands in diametrical opposition to Gilani's idealistic stance of enabling the people of Kashmir for their right of plebiscite. A leading Indian sociologist, Ashish Nandi, also busts this myth of Islamophobia when he says, during the last century, the most atrocious cruelty has been committed not in the name of religion, though we might like to believe that, but in the name of reason and aesthetics. And secular states have killed more people than non-secular states. So Islamophobes seem to put such facts under erasure that an Indian emperor, Ashoka, in the BC period, not only renounces bloodshed, but becomes a Buddhist. While due to the peaceful influence of Islam, Rinchana, a Tibetan prince, becomes a Muslim in the 14th century. And the Balbir Singhs, they embrace Islam in the 20th century. It is this peaceful understanding of Islam that many writers advocate, as opposed to the tale of bloodshed, dispossession, marginalization, loss of life, and erasure that we are witnessing in a post-revocation period of Kashmir. Contemporary literature, memoirs, petite memoirs, anthologies, historical writings, and political criticisms record how the recent historic appropriation of land starts with seriously questionable accession of Hari Singh with his decision to join India, which is contested and proved as false by Alistair Lamb, one of the pioneer historian on the land. So these internal colonialists, as some critics would call them, were Indians installed puppet rulers and a part of the trusted old political football, as Arundhati Roy puts it. So many books of impartial writers inform about many instances like de jure direct intervention of in the state of Jammu and Kashmir as early as 5th May 1947. So we need to put our historical records straight. When with the result that when India overtly intervened in Kashmir on 27th October 1947, the Maharaja of Patiala lost no time in joining his men, some of already in the field in Jammu and Kashmir. Jammu massacre in September 1947, it happened just 5 days before Pakistan irregulars attack in Jammu and Kashmir, and 9 days before Maharaja's accession to India. So Ian Stephens, an editor of The Statesman, suggests that large-scale massacre of Muslims happened with the approval of Maharaja Hari Singh. Many other writers questions the subsuming of the brutal massacres carried out by the Indian forces under the rhetoric of war on terror. In an anthology by Mishra and Roy and other, Tariq Ali's mention of the invitation of the Israeli military officers to visit Akhnour's military base in the province and advise on counter-terrorism measure reminds of the de jure accomplice between India and Israel that Sumanta Bose has written in his book, Contested Lands. On one example of expose of this Islamophobia, this is some pictorial depiction of Jammu and massacre when the unofficial figures are 500,000. All right. So the expose, this I was talking about expose of this Islamophobia that may be seen in India Conclave today, India's biggest platform where business leaders, politicians, thinkers, and icons from every field come together to expose and exchange ideas. In its 2017 platform, it was a debate on Kashmir titled Kashmir, What Next? So these were some of the figures that were spoken on that platform, that hoax of war or terror, basically, which is war of terror, I was calling it. On this platform, it was told that 700,000 army making Kashmir a region with the biggest army concentration around the globe, 150,000 armored police, even village defense committees are given guns in Kashmir for 13 million people in Kashmir. And Arundhati Roy calls this 600,000 actively deployed armed personnel for a population of 10 million people. So this is something which Kunal Mukherjee had written earlier in his 2014 article, and he had spoken very.
Professor Rabia?
Yes.
Professor Rabia, you have just 2 minutes to conclude, please.
Okay, sir. Yes, I'm winding up. The lack of professionalism, he says, has been one of the factors, and he says that forests, for instance, have been cut and the woods obtained is being sold illegally on a large scale by the security forces. The barren mountains testify to this. And he then also says about local people talk about how the officers carried back truckloads of such furniture when their term came to an end in Kashmir. So on this conclave media platform, it was told that more than 280,000 canal land has been confiscated by the Indian occupied forces, 5,200 sawing machines to saw down around 3 to 4 lakh trees in Shopian district alone. And this Islamophobia or war of terror in the last 20 years, it was mentioned on this platform that 100,000 lakh people murdered, Jammu massacre, 250,000 massacred in the Jammu region after giving them the false promise of sending them to Pakistan. Unofficial figures of massacre was 500,000, 100,000 people migrated, 60,000 women were raped. in the last 20 years, 8 to 10 missing people, 1,000 missing people, 100,000 young people have been tortured. And ironically, promotions of personnel of CRPF, BSF on regular army, if they kill, that they get promotions before even dead body is picked up. And these interpellations are accompanied by the added cruelty of miming the killed as militants. 50,000 orphans, 30,000 widows, 2,700 unmarked graves, which can be mass graves, which has now the number is 6277. And Human Rights Commission was finally shamed into officially acknowledging the existence of 2,700 unmarked graves from these 3 districts only of Kashmir. In peaceful demonstrations, 2008, 200 people died, and so on and so forth. Kashmir Wala, and as per the annual report 2017-18 released by the Ministry of Home Affairs, the year 2017 witnessed a 6.21% increase in the militancy incidents, while as 166% increase in the fatalities of civilians in comparison to corresponding period of 2016. So this raises the question, why this Islamophobia? Is this war on terror or war of terror? I leave it for my audience to decide. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Rabia, for this historical account. I'm quite fascinated by your presentation and the elaboration of the historical kind of narratives and how things have been shaped. One of the things I would like to engage you with, and engage, of course, the audience around, I think in one of your writings, I think some time ago, you have observed that those who were writing and the writers had a tendency before the 9/11 to write about, decolonization basically as a trend in their writings. Yes. While after 9/11, there were probably a tendency to become in between rather than becomes critiques of basically as it was the case before, and we know that the subcontinent had number of authors, number of writers who have wrote extensively in the issue of criticizing the colonization era basically. And when we talk about those writers, we are not talking just writers from Kashmir or from Pakistan. I mean from the whole region. I would like to know, for the benefit of our discussion, how Islamophobia and how war and terror has probably made some shift in this intellectual capacity, in this intellectual, literally kind of trend, basically. That's number one. And number two is what we know historically that Pakistan has been as like a front state on the war on terror. However, Pakistan had its own, of course, issues in the eyes of the grand strategy of the Americans, basically. One, of course, is Pakistan is a nuclear country, and at the same time, there were sentiments of anti-Americanism in Pakistan. We have seen the Pakistan Taliban as a form of activism, you can say, in Pakistan. And of course, Pakistan had a role in terms of Afghanistan and the era of the Mujahideen during Zia al-Haq. Now, I think this kind of situation, this kind of an ally for the US, probably my question is that India has shifted to become more of an ally for the US than Pakistan, at least in the last few years. I pose these two questions. Hopefully, if we have any questions as well from the audience, we can share and we engage with you, Professor Rabia. Please go ahead.
Okay. I ask
no,
give the answer now, or do we
not
have
now?
them
Not now, later, but just to engage you, if you can write down these questions. Now, I think it is time to engage our colleague, Omer Kanat, who was supposed to be with us today. He is a Uyghur human rights activist and director of the Uyghur Human Rights Project, basically. and he's a research-based Uyghur human rights, as I can see here in his bio. He, of course, he has done a lot of work in terms of recording this kind of crisis. Right now, of course, due to family basically emergency, he couldn't be with us. Dr. Ubaid from Zaim University is going to deliver his speech basically, so that if Dr. Ubaid can join us, please, and make the lecture, present the lecture, please.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This paper is, again, on behalf of Omar Kanat, who is not able to join us. It does not reflect my opinions or those of SIGA. However, we're happy to read it on his behalf and at his request, and inshallah, everything is well for Mr. Kanat and his family. The title, The Geopolitics of the Global War on Terror, the Case of the Uyghurs. Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to join you today. My name is Omar Kanat. I'm a Uyghur. The Uyghurs are a Turkic people. We have followed Islam for over 1,000 years. We call our homeland East Turkestan. The Chinese government calls it Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Xinjiang means new territory. This shows that the Chinese Empire in 1884 considered it a conquered land. Since Chinese communists took over East Turkestan in 1949, the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim people have suffered political, cultural, and religious repression on a massive scale. For a brief period after Mao died in 1976, repression was less severe. Many people were released from prison and labor camps, and some mosques were rebuilt. But the government still carried out repression in our homeland in the name of suppressing so-called separatism. In the 1990s, the government's justification changed to the three evil forces. The three evil forces were separatism, religious extremism, and terrorism. In 1996, when China founded the Shanghai Cooperation Organization with Russia and the Central Asian countries, all the governments agreed to work together to carry out this fight against the so-called three evil forces. Suddenly, after September 11th, 2001, we didn't hear much about separatism. Instead, China told everyone that it faced a major problem of Islamic extremism and international terrorism. Before September 2001, Beijing never talked about international terrorism. Only after the Bush administration launched the global war on terror did China start talking about international terrorist links. Let me explain more about how suddenly this changed. In the year 2000, the Chinese government was in the middle of a big propaganda campaign to attract international investment in our homeland. They called it the Great Western Development Plan. State media reports talked about how the Xinjiang government was doing a great job with economic development and that it was the perfect place for investment in energy, mining, transportation. Here is a headline from April 1999, quote, China leads world in deep reservoir oil exploiting. Here is a headline from July 20th, 2001, quote, Canada expects to be China's partner in developing West. The big message was Xinjiang is open for development. That all changed on a dime. China declared that it was the victim of a major Uyghur terrorist network with international ties to international jihadi networks. Unfortunately, this propaganda worked. The US and the UN even agreed to China's lobbying to put a Uyghur group on the International Terrorist Watch List. This was the so-called East Turkestan Islamic Movement, or ETIM. It was designated as an international terrorist threat on August 19th, 2002. Experts at the time agreed that this was a highly questionable decision. For more detail, Sean Roberts wrote recently in Foreign Policy, why did the United States take China's word on supposed Uyghur terrorists? The Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement barely existed, but Washington wanted Beijing on board for the war on terror. The link is provided after I finish this. I will put this link in the comment section for this article that he references. I highly recommend Professor Roberts' new book. It took another 19 years before ETIM was removed from the US terrorism designation in October 2020. In short, Uyghurs were collateral damage in the global war on terror. International acceptance of the Chinese government's narrative shows that the world was already hoodwinked by China once, just 20 years ago. Is the world being fooled now by China's narrative on the current genocide? The world is divided. Let me explain what Uyghur Human Rights Program has documented, along with investigative reporting by more than 50 independent media outlets over the past 4 years. The UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, 50 independent UN human rights special rapport and experts, more than 50 genocide prevention organizations, and a major report put out by Azim Ibrahim, more than 30 other experts earlier just this month. This major report concludes that China has violated each and every act of the 1948 Genocide Convention. Now, my people are in concentration camps, rounded up in massive numbers because of our ethno-religious identity. Currently, estimates are that 2 to 3 million people were rounded up and placed in camps without a trial. We have lost touch with our families. All Uyghurs abroad, whether in Turkey, Europe, Canada, Australia, Kazakhstan, or elsewhere, got messages 3 years ago from our relatives saying, "Do not call me again." They deleted us from their chats. Our relatives were victims of mass disappearance. Many Uyghurs found out later, indirectly, that parents, sisters, brothers had died in custody. This began in 2017. Until 2018, the Chinese government denied that it was conducting a mass internment campaign. Then, after an August 2018 UN meeting, the Chinese government suddenly reversed course. The government admitted the Uyghurs and Kazakhs were rounded up en masse, but denied that they were prisons and detention centers. Instead, the government claimed they were vocational training schools. This should have been unbelievable based on satellite images alone, showing high security facilities suddenly built all over our homeland with barbed wire and guard towers. What was happening inside the camps? Millions of Uyghurs in concentration camps have suffered unspeakable trauma. Survivors have told us they are tortured, starved, raped, forbidden from speaking their language, and given unknown drugs. They were forced to say over and over, "My soul was infected with a disease, and I don't believe in God. I believe in the Communist Party." Basically, Islam is considered as a disease and mental illness by the Chinese government. Some were moved from the camps directly to prison. A Uyghur woman in the US recently learned that her sister was sent to prison after spending 2 years in the camps. She was sentenced for 7 years for praying at her father's funeral, and another 10 years sentenced for having a Quran in her house. The assault on Islam is total. Uyghur Human Rights Program 2019 report on the destruction and desecration of Uyghur mosques gave detailed documentation on mosques that have been destroyed. The latest research by Australian Strategic Policy Institute shows that 35% of mosques have been completely destroyed since 2017. Another 30% damaged or turned into cafes, recreation centers, and one mosque has become a public toilet. The assault on Uyghur families is total. Many Uyghurs abroad face the nightmare that their nieces and nephews, their grandchildren, or even their own small children were taken away to a state orphanage. They are forbidden to speak Uyghur and are raised as Chinese children. Probably they will be separated forever. Even if the camps are closed, we can never trace these children if they have lost all memories of their families. My people are also being subjected to mass prevention of births. It is being called demographic genocide. In a few years, there will likely be few Uyghur marriages and very few Uyghur babies born. It is a brazen plan to eradicate the Uyghurs as a people. Some Uyghurs have been taken from the camps into a massive program of forced labor. The government's plans for so-called poverty alleviation have a horrific end goal. Every adult Uyghur who is not in camp or prison must be in a controlled place of work. They are taken away from their businesses and farms and forced to work in factories where they can be watched closely. Government documents prove that massive numbers of Uyghurs were forced to pick cotton without pay in 2018 and 2019. 84% of China's cotton is grown in my homeland. That means at least 1 in 5 cotton garments worldwide is probably made with Uyghur slave labor. Uyghurs live under constant surveillance and fear even outside camps. High-tech surveillance covers Uyghurs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, through cameras, DNA collection, mandatory apps on every Uyghur's phone. Police stations and checkpoints are everywhere. It is high-tech racial profiling. Huawei is selling so-called Muslim tracking software to the government using facial recognition, voice prints, and other data. The Chinese government has also sent more than 1 million government cadres into Uyghur homes to spy and report on the families. Chinese propaganda calls it becoming family. But in fact, these Han Chinese cadres effectively destroy Uyghur family life. There's also emerging evidence of sexual abuse and rape in these situations. The officials post photos on social media showing how they are sleeping in the same bed with the family to show that they are carrying out this program. Uyghurs abroad suffer psychological torment and grief. We are living with trauma because of nightmares about our own family members, schoolmates, and friends. We are living with the knowledge that our people and our homeland are being erased step by step. My organization, the Uyghur Human Rights Project, has also documented that the Chinese government is weaponizing passports of Uyghurs in Turkey and other countries who still have Chinese passports. When their passports are expiring, the government says they must go back to China to renew them. If they go, they face certain detention and torture and death. But once their passport expires, they become stateless without work permits. Children cannot go to school, they cannot access healthcare, and they are constantly at risk of deportation. This is why Uyghurs have been in a state of panic about the proposed Turkey-China extradition agreement. In conclusion, the case of the Uyghurs showed that the Chinese government successfully has used the 9/11 attacks to justify its iron fist policies, its war on Islam, and its war on Uyghurs. The justification is still successful for domestic audiences. In fact, just this week, the Chinese government was able to mobilize domestic support by manufacturing outrage against foreign companies like H&M and Nike that made statements of concern about Uyghur forced labor in the global cotton supply chain. Internationally, the Chinese government's cynical use of the global war on terror has worked for nearly 20 years. Now that Uyghurs have suffered total repression for 4 years, politicians around the world have finally begun to recognize that this is the largest mass internment since Germany's genocidal policies in World War II. Canada, the Netherlands, and the US have all formally recognized the Chinese government's war on Uyghurs constitutes crimes against humanity and genocide. Other governments, countries continue to support China's position because they want China's support in the UN. because they themselves commit massive human rights abuses, or because they want Chinese loans and investment. The question for these remaining governments is how long they can continue to close their eyes to a 21st century genocide. Thank you again for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Ubaid, for this presentation on behalf of Dr. Omer Kanat. And I think it is now the time to move to the next speaker, Dr. Maung Zarni. He's a fellow of the Genocide Documentation Center in Cambodia. He's co-founder of Rith, a Southeast Asian activist organization, and he has a very distinctive CV, and that he has been quite active defending the Rohingya Muslims through a number of platforms, basically. Without further ado, I will introduce Dr. Maung Zarni, please, to take the floor. Please unmute and provide us your presentation on the Rohingya Muslims crisis. Dr. Zarni, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Yes, please. Go ahead. Thank you. Thank
you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor to be among the distinguished speakers. As I listened to, two previous presentations on Kashmir and Uyghur persecution of genocidal proportions in China, I decided to, slightly change what I was planning to present, simply the Rohingya genocide, the case of Muslim minorities in northern Arakan state, Western Burma. As you know, Burma is undergoing tremendous shock, including the Rohingya who live in Rangoon and other cities, concealing their identities before the military coup began. They kept their heads down, and there is also close to 1 million Rohingyas who had fled, or I should say survived, the genocidal persecution of 2016 and 17 and the previous wave, since 1978. And if the Uyghur kept in concentration camps constitute the largest internment or concentration camp since the end of the Third Reich and its genocide, the Rohingyas suffer the longest process of genocidal destruction. And as many of you are aware, the Rohingyas became only headline in the last several years, since many of us watched on Facebook Live hundreds of thousands of Rohingyas streaming out of Western Myanmar into the Bangladesh. They have suffered quietly, during the Cold War and then transitional period after the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and then continue to suffer. The genocide in Burma has long been institutionalized. And to relate this back to the theme of the conference, the Islamophobia and the global war on terror, we have about 40% of our populations who are from different ethnic and faith backgrounds. Out of a total of 55 or 54 million Burmese people, about 35 to 40% of them belong to what the UN would legally describe as national minorities or protected groups. under the Genocide Convention, on the basis of race, faith, ethnicity, and national identity. And so Rohingya constitute a national minority that is to be protected under international law with respect to the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And although there are other national minorities that have lived in Burma, or what we call today within the boundaries of Burma for centuries, predating the emergence of post-colonial nation states, and Burma as such became a nation state only after the formal dissolution of the British Empire towards or after the Second World War ended. So there are other groups that settled different newly drawn national boundaries. We are surrounded by 5 different neighbors: Bangladesh, India, Laos, China, and Thailand. And then we have a long coastal line in the Bay of Bengal. But only in the Rohingya area that intersect with the new boundaries of East Pakistan before 1973, and then after that, Bangladesh. Only that region is characterized as essentially a dangerous border because, the region of Rakhine or Arakan in the ancient terminology is immediately next to one of the largest and most populous Muslim nation, 167 million people of Bangladesh. So the Rohingyas' proximity to a large Muslim nation and its religious identity became major causes of concern for the Burmese military. And so as early as late 1960s, the Burmese military strategists who controlled the border regions, even during the parliamentary democracy period from 1948 to 1962, decided that the Muslim character of this Western Burma needs to be changed because it poses a threat to a Buddhist way of life for the Buddhist majority named Rakhine within that province or Rakhine state. And the Rohingyas are a minority within the minority state. They're outnumbered by the Buddhist Rakhine 3-1. Still, that small population was framed as a threat to Buddhist way of life culturally and demographically. And secondly, the fact that the Rohingyas live right next to Bangladesh, at the time East Pakistan and later Bangladesh, as I said, they have demographic, cultural, linguistic, and commercial linkages with the adjacent communities on the East Pakistan or Bangladeshi side. And so that is actually a universal phenomenon, whether you're looking at, let's just say, Europe, say for instance, Poland. Poland has shared borders with, Ukraine, Germany, and Czechoslovakia, I believe. And in our case, the Burmese case, other national minorities also have these bicultural or binational links with neighboring countries. But only Rohingyas have been singled out because none other national minorities that settle along the Burmese borders with, say, Thailand or Laos or China or India have Islam as their faith. And so the religious identity became a basis for persecution. And also from the military's perspective, there's a strategic calculation. In the event that Bangladesh, with the area half the size of Burma, but population about 4 times as high, decides to relieve itself of demographic pressure, they could use the Muslims, that is Rohingyas, on the Burmese side as a proxy to snatch a piece of Burmese land, or so did the military, planners reason. And so from late 1970s onward, when attempts to peacefully re-engineer the demographic character of this region from officially and predominantly Muslim to Buddhist demographic characteristics. When the peaceful attempts to do that failed for a number of reasons, the military decided that they would shift gear and launched a violent terror campaign. Initially, it started out as an ethnic cleansing campaign to clear the area of this particular national minority because they've been deemed or misframed as a threat to Buddhist way of life and a national security in terms of territorial integrity, insofar as the Bangladeshis, Bangladesh perceived long-term objective. But that evolved over time. I'm talking about 40 years from 1978 February up to now. Evolved into a textbook example of a genocide. Yeah. And a number of years ago, I think like back in 2017, in the middle of Rohingyas by the hundreds of thousands filing out of Burma across the border, the UN Secretary General was asked by James Bay of Al Jazeera, how would you describe the situation, like ethnic cleansing? And so Antonio Guterres said, yeah, this is a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. But in that exchange, what was lost was the fact that there is no textbook for ethnic cleansing or international law. There are only textbooks for genocides and international treaty or international law against instigating genocide against national minority considered under international law protected group. But fast forward today, I'm really pleased to report to all of you, the panelists and those who are watching, there is a seismic and very positive shift in terms of the Burmese popular opinion. As you know, no country or no people was born anti-Muslim or anti-Buddhist or anti-Jew or anti-Christian. So the public are like Pavlovian creatures, typically subjected to very extensive and systematic state propaganda, whatever the content of that propaganda. So for years, the Burmese public had been primed by the Burmese military, who told them in Burmese media outlets, policy briefings, teacher education programs, that Rohingyas don't belong to Northern Arakan or Western Burma, and that they are illegal migrants, or that they were unwelcome descendants of the British colonial era seasonal agricultural workers from Bangladesh. So therefore, they need to be called Bengali. So the public over the last 10 years was subject to intense, Nazi-like propaganda against Rohingya people. And if you show official or historical primary sources to Burmese, even scholars and experts who you would expect to have a higher level of critical thinking, you show them in Burmese or English language sources. Look, the encyclopedia says here that Rohingyas belong to Burma, and the northern Arakan or western Myanmar was their ancestral homeland. And this is their name. This was not a fake name. They will refuse to believe. But over the last two months, since the coup of February 1, the Burmese public, I'm talking about a majority dominant Buddhist public who live in towns and cities and large villages, they all of a sudden wake up to the fact that the kind of criminal and criminalistic terroristic treatment that Rohingyas had been meted out by the Burmese government, they are now subject to that kind of treatment. Of course, it's not on the genocidal proportion. Certainly, a 400,000 strong military could not possibly commit a genocide against them. Let's just say, 45 million majority Buddhist Burmese population. Yesterday alone, the military killed 100 unarmed civilians, and the youngest were, I believe, 7 years old, and not even protesters. Some are children who were playing in the playground, and when they saw soldiers coming, they ran to their parents out of fear, and the children were shot just simply because they made a move, out of fear. And so one thing that triggered this seismic shift in popular opinion was the Rohingyas themselves have shown tremendous capacity to reconcile and the desire to belong to Burma, and which was factually their homeland. And so when they saw their peers, Burmese, Buddhists, and Christians and others in Burma, being shot dead, sniped in cold blood by the very security troops that committed genocide only 4 years ago, they showed empathy and they showed concerns. They showed solidarity. That was one of the major trigger points which made the Burmese public feel ashamed, and they also which woke them up to the fact that differences in faith, Islam or Buddhism or Christianity or Hinduism, none of these religious differences pose a threat to any society or population that wish to live in peace and not simply live peacefully together, but as an integrated social unit. So the Burmese are undergoing a major seismic social transformation, and they want Rohingya back. And there are a lot of, there's an outpouring of apologies, formal apologies from university student unions, celebrities, and Facebook users and social media users that simply say, we are sorry that we have been, brainwashed, and we realize.
Yes. Dr. Zarni, keep track of time. We just have 2 minutes to finish, please.
That's fine. I'll wrap it up. And so this is a tremendous shift in public attitude and sentiment towards the surviving community. And so this is something that is very, very significant when we talk about Rohingya case. And then finally, my comments is, within the global war on terror, what's really shocking is, despite the fact that the Rohingya population is predominantly Muslims. There are also a very small number of Hindu Rohingyas as well. So I don't want to paint Rohingyas as all, a monolithic group. What is shocking is even some of the Muslim countries like Pakistan would supply arms to the Burmese military, train military intelligence officers in Islamabad and other places. Yeah? And yesterday, the Burmese military held an annual armed forces parade in Naypyidaw capital, while the troops were shooting and killing, over 100 people and terrorizing large segments of populations in 44 different cities. Pakistan, Bangladesh, these are two, primarily Muslim countries. They sent their representatives. And to be in the company of those, the Burmese military officers and generals who committed genocide. Yeah? And not to mention India with its own, Hindu fundamentalist, Islamophobic national policy. So I think my final comment is we have to have a different type of international system of governance that are driven by universal humanism, not simply driven by the self-interest of selling arms or trying to secure a piece of economic pie from a natural resource rich countries such as Burma. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Professor Zarni, for such elaboration, such highlighting of the crisis since it is beginning. I would like now to move to Professor Farid Hafez, who is a researcher from the University of Salzburg, to highlight on the issue of academic curtailing that is taking place in Europe. Professor, the microphone is yours. Please unmute and go ahead.
All right, thank you so much for having me here. I feel very honored. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Professor. You go ahead.
Perfect, wonderful, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, most.
Okay, what I'm going to present now is, it's not like a finalized paper that I have, but it's more like the whole invitation was kind of an invitation for me to think about what and to start something, thinking about scholarship, critical scholarship, and the problem of an emerging and developing and expanding Islamophobia in the state sphere into the sphere of the education. And basically, I took on one side, I took my own case as a point of departure in making my own thoughts about this. And at the very same time, obviously, many of the things that are happening today in the world, and especially also in Europe, also triggered me to reflect upon what is going on in these days. So obviously, what we can see in Europe, I think, is that more and more critical thinkers are facing more and more pressure. I mean, there are really many examples. Just take, for instance, the decolonial thinker Achille Mbembe, who was actually a very, very often invited guest in Germany, has been praised even by very mainstream media outlets, publishing houses. And one of the things that happened a few years ago, maybe some of you know, is there was a disinvitation based on the German parliament, which passed a resolution in the first half of the year 2019, where it branded the BDS movement as an anti-Semitic movement. So Achille Mbembe was actually scheduled to give a keynote address in an important event in Germany. And then this was canceled because the claim was that Achille Mbembe had relativized the Holocaust and denied Israel's right to exist. So, I mean, not only was his invitation withdrawn, but also the festival itself later was canceled due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But the case still is like critical scholarship was denied an audience in Germany based on these new state regulations, the resolution against BDS in that case. Then we have the case, a much more recent case of David Miller at Bristol University. We have Cornel West, who was denied tenure at Harvard University as a critical scholar. And more recently, and this is something that I will talk a little bit more about because it's much more directly related, I think, to the issue of Islamophobia, is the issue of the French case, the French state's authorities. So all in all, I think what we can see is that there is a growing anxiety on behalf of Europe that fears critical investigation into issues of race, gender, Islamophobia, colonialism. And we see different kinds of how that manifests and how that curtails scholarship of European scholars. Still, what somebody might argue is, isn't scholarship, especially the social sciences, isn't scholarship generally always either in favor of political power or in opposition to it? And I would say, yes, it is. And I think certain forms, I mean, that's obvious, certain forms of academic disciplines have even emerged directly from political engagement, right? We only have to think about Edward Said's great work, Orientalism, where he very clearly demonstrated that the scholarship of European powers was inextricably tied to the imperialist societies who produced this knowledge, not only making the Orient a projection of Europe's anxieties and desires, but in fact creating it to govern it. And as we know, several of the academic disciplines that emerged during that period of the great imperialism was especially came out of these endeavors, like ethnology, which was designed to understand and subsequently rule the indigenous peoples in newly conquered territory. But even before that, like, we don't have to go back as early as imperialism. Even before that, also before colonialism, scholarship was very often intertwined with political power structures, be it the court scholars in the Middle Ages or the scholars of the intelligence apparatus during the Cold War. Like, knowledge production has very often been essential in one way or another to stabilize the power structures or the political order, or the opposite, to destabilize it as oppositional activism. So as much as political authority depends on knowledge production that upholds the stance of the political order, critical scholarship can also be very dangerous. And I think this is where I want to talk about this current French example that I'm sure most of you have been following. Post-colonial gender, racism studies have all been essentially there to critique racial power structures, as have, for instance, on the other side, ethnic studies been essential to empower marginalized groups. And for me, one of the most telling recent examples here is this French debate that we are witnessing currently about the so-called Islamo-Gauchism, or Islamo-leftism in English. A concept which originally originated in circles of French far-right folks, accusing leftist theorists of paving the way intellectually to be a breeding ground for what has been called Islamist extremism. So, and I think that's a very interesting point already, right? Because once you say that certain disciplines, academic disciplines, certain critiques are a breeding ground for extremism and subsequently for violence, then what you're basically doing is you're trying to marginalize this kind of academic discipline. And like many other terminologies used in the Islamophobic vocabulary of Europe, this notion of Islamoleftism is so influential, has become so influential, that it's actually shared in large circles congregating in the corridors of power. It's not anymore a vocabulary that is situated at the margins, the right-wing margins of French society, but it is a mainstream notion, right? The French president Emmanuel Macron literally accused post-colonial or anti-colonial academic discourse as something that is being imported into France coming from the United States. And what he accused it of is that it would be alienating French citizens of Arab or African descent. And at the very same time, he was not alone. Even his education minister announced a probe into what he called Islamoleftism, right? In French universities. He said literally, and I quote unquote, "I think that Islamoleftism is eating away at our society as a whole, and universities are not immune and are part of our society," end quote. So basically what he does is he accuses post-colonial and racism studies to divide the French nation. So for Macron, these disciplines are an enemy to the imagined secular and institutionally race-blind French society. And this culture war that we can observe here basically defends positions of privilege which is waged in various parts of the world. We see that in Hungary, where the elites rally against gender studies, and we see this discourse similar in the United States taking place, where we have this discourse about the cancel culture, which becomes nothing less but a shield to allow any kind of blatant racist argument to flow on campuses and on TV. And we also see it in Germany, where one of the few post-colonial theorists who really want to do something about Germany's colonial amnesia, how it is often called, are called a pressure group. So if you're an academic at the university and you become framed as a pressure group, basically the argument is that there is something as would be called objective academia, which is basically stabilizing the power structures. And if you are questioning these structures, then you become a pressure group. You subsequently are positioned outside of the academia, and you become, and this is an attempt to marginalize these people who do that kind of critical scholarship. So similarly, I see that Islamophobia studies, and a lot of the Islamophobia, the research on Islamophobia that has taken place, has been done through the lens of post-colonial and racism studies, right? And Islamophobia studies have also been attacked by academics who, again, have been favored by the power structures. Like if we go back in the first phase of debating Islamophobia in the late 1990s, when this terminology first came up, there was an invented accusation according to which Islamophobia is a term invented by Iranian mullahs to criminalize any critique of Islam. While, as we know, in fact, the notion had already been used nearly 100 years before. The more known story is about the French Algeria, but there has also been Italian scholars which used this terminology 100 years ago, as some studies by my dear friend Armin Muftic, who did a PhD thesis on that in the University of Innsbruck, has shown, going back to the archives of the Vatican. So when studies on Islamophobia increased following the destruction of the Manhattan Twin Towers, so were also different arguments mounted to delegitimize every critique on the racialization of Muslims and their subsequent discrimination. And later, and this is what we see today, academics contested that the term was even invented not by the Iranian mullahs, but this time by the Muslim Brotherhood. And it was introduced by them to delegitimize any critique towards Islamist organizations and not the religion of Islam only. So that was the argument that was taken by those scholars who are near the power structures. And one of the things that we can observe here is that the governments in Austria and France, and these are the two cases that I want to speak here about, and I think they have been really at the forefront of institutionalizing Islamophobia in their political system, who have been banning the hijab in school, raiding Muslim associations, closing mosques. They have been especially sensitive to the allegation of state Islamophobia. Accordingly, there are many state-sponsored institutions who have used these academics to help to push back any kind of critique vis-a-vis the state institutions. To give you just one example, there is this very famous French author, Pascal Bruckner, who just recently wrote this book, Un racisme imaginaire, la querelle de l'islamophobie, which is an imaginary racism, as he called it, the dispute about Islamophobia. So that was the title of his book, where he basically argued that Islamophobia is a word invented to silence the critics of a religion, thus refuting any debate on this hegemonic form of racism that is on the rise throughout Europe. And in Austria, very recently, we have seen the government establishing the Documentation Center Political Islam, Dokumentationszentrum Politischer Islam, which is a monitoring center that maps and surveils Muslim civil society organizations alleging that Islamists, quote unquote, wrapped with the cloak of democracy, are trying to Islamize the society. So this is what one of the head of the advisory board, a professor of theology, a Muslim professor of theology, argued. He said, Islamophobia, quote unquote, and anti-Muslim racism have meanwhile become combat terms of political Islam to suggest that Western societies are per se anti-Muslim, end quote. So he suggests that basically talking about Islamophobia would strengthen a position of victimhood, would be in the service of what he calls, whatever that means, political Islam. And very recently, what we have seen is that while the academics in powerful positions are highly subsidized, on the other side, anti-racist activists and scholars live on the margin. We all saw what happened last autumn in France, where the state closed more than 50 Muslim anti-racist and anti-racist organizations. Among them, the largest civil society organization monitoring Islamophobia, the Collective Against Islamophobia in France, CCIF, which moved now to Belgium to protect itself from dissolution. In Austria, a raid happened 1 week after a former Daesh sympathizer killed 4 people on the street. But the victims of the raid were not related to the murderous scene. Rather, it was, again, Muslim civil society organization and individuals like me who were raided. Our homes were stormed by special forces at 5 o'clock in the morning, waking up our kids with heavy weapons in their hands, right? So this suspicion was being part of a terrorist organization and financed terrorism without any proof whatsoever, but based on baseless claims. And the effect is obviously devastating. There was a prejudgment by the media, a lot of financial harm, and I would say, as a consequence coming out of that, also the delegitimization of one of 2 core editors of the European Islamophobia report. So again, who wants to listen to a terrorist, right? So that's the argument that will come sooner or later. So most interesting and this is one of the things that I want to pick up out here, just one of the many, many details without speaking too much about this very specific case.
Professor Farid, you have to keep track on time. You just have 2 minutes.
Wonderful. 2 minutes is enough. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm just gonna reveal some of the questions that were asked to the alleged terrorists once the interrogation happened. One of the questions was, how many non-Muslim friends do you have? Do you visit a mosque? And if yes, which mosque? May your son marry a Christian, unbeliever, or Jew? Do you want to introduce Sharia? Now, okay, all of these questions we know from the Islamophobia handbook, right? That's well-known narratives of anti-Muslim discourse. But here comes a much more troubling question. Beyond religious, personal religiosity that is interfered into here. One of the questions was, what do you understand by the term Islamophobia? In your opinion, is this term justified? If so, please explain why and what do you understand by this term? Are Muslims suppressed in Austria? So these questions are very revealing, right? So what shall somebody, not only like me, but anybody say who is like a critical observer of what is going on with state institutions and the marginalization of Muslims? What answer could be justified to give in order to prove yourself innocent, right? So what does this mean even beyond my own personal case and the case of 29 other people who were raided? Should Muslims censor themselves where to pray? Should scholars of anti-Muslim racism stop studying Islamophobia? Should students who wrote the thesis on anti-Muslim racism become worried given their thesis is public in the university's library? So I think what we are witnessing here in countries like Austria and France is that various people in powerful positions are using their leverage to delegitimize any thinking on race, gender, colonialism, to prevent basically a debate that frightens the centers of power to take place. And with that I end, and I thank you for participating, looking forward to a fruitful discussion. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Professor Farid, for this fascinating, I would say, presentation and highlights. Now it's the time for question and answer. And if you would allow me, I will start with Professor Rabia, and then I will introduce Ms. Aiden, and she will answer the questions came from the audience related to the Uyghur. And then Professor Zarni for the questions related to the Rohingya Myanmar. And last but not least, Professor Farid, we have very good questions from the audience here for you. Professor Rabia, if you allow me, I raised 2 quick questions from my side, and I will raise a few other questions as well to you. The questions related to those literal writers who were writing like decolonization before 9/11 and before the introduction of the war on terror, and then post 9/11 and the war on terror, there were changes basically in their writings. That's number one. Number two, the US has considered Pakistan as a front state against terrorism. And it has its own concerns when it comes to Pakistan being a nuclear Muslim country. And of course, the anti-Americanization or anti-American kind of sentiments in Pakistan, the presence of Taliban in Pakistan, and the schools, the Islamic schools, madrasas in Pakistan, these have been concerns for the US. Now, the question is, in light of this and the shift that has happened in the American politics when it comes to relationship in terms of India and Pakistan and their conflicts, how do you see basically this complicated geopolitical kind of state related, of course, to this global war on terror, as well as, of course, the writers and the elite? There were as well some questions from the audience that I should put together here. how to relate as well your historical account that you have presented and you have analyzed regarding Kashmir to this Islamophobia, current Islamophobia, and the current war on terror, basically. How can you really bridge the gap? I will give you the floor to answer and grab these issues, hopefully, and highlight from your side. And then I can move, of course, to Ms. Aiden. Please, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Professor Fattah. As far as the writers, if you're talking about the writers of Kashmiri writers, yes. Let me be very honest about this thing that Kashmiri writings, they were Kashmiri writers, they were not speaking about the we can call it now Islamophobia as in the context of this conference. However, they were not speaking so forthrightly before 9/11. But after 9/11, because 90s, as you know, that there was a lot of propaganda about, as they quote unquote, the jihadi element, and, we need to dust off that connotation of jihad also, which the writers, Pakistani writers, some of the Pakistani writers were doing at that time in the first decade of this millennium. However, Kashmiri writers, they were not so vocal before 9/11. However, after 9/11, there are two writers basically who can be taken as the seminal writers. One is Basharat Peer, he wrote his memoir. One is Iftikhar Gilani, he wrote his memoir, My Days in Prison. And Basharat Peer, he wrote Curfewed Night. So these were the seminal works. After that, there is a body of writers and petit memoirs written on Kashmir, and the ordinary people, they started writing, and then there are very good critics who have emerged and who are based in US, because of course people living in Kashmir, they cannot speak. Iftikhar Gilani has moved to Turkey. Hafsa Kanjwal is also in America. Mohamed Junaid is also in US. Muzammil Ayub Thakur is in UK. So the thing is that the critics, of course, they can speak from there, from when they're outside. However, the writings, the personal narrations, there is a body of writings, and interestingly, the writings are not coming from only Muslims. For example, Arundhati Roy, she writes an article, Seditious Nehru, in 2011 book, anthology. Pankaj Mishra is writing. Sanjay Kak has given an anthology which is Intifada in Kashmir. And then Suvir Kaul has written his book, From Gardens to Graves, in 2000, as late as 2017. So basically, and he's a Kashmiri Pandit, and he's a professor of University of Pennsylvania. So he's written that book, From Gardens to Graves. So meaning, what I mean to say is that after 9/11, yes, and after those two seminal works, people started writing. That's one thing. The other thing that you asked was, like, I am no expert. I'm a student of literature. However, let me be very straightforward about this thing. I would say that there is an Islamophobia with regards to Pakistan also. Because we are a Muslim majority, country, so therefore there is an Islamophobia vis-a-vis to our stance. I'm not advocating, and I'm not taking sides with any, stance. Otherwise, it may be some wrong policies also. However, the fact remains that it is so. And lastly, you talked about. I forgot about that. Lastly.
Basically, how to bridge between the historical analysis you made and the current Islamophobia in regard to Kashmir.
All right. See, we students of literature, we tend to talk in a kind of a parable. whatever has been going on in history, and I've quoted it categorically, I have, quoted it from the books of history. I have worked on this. My dissertation, my PhD dissertation is on Kashmir and Palestine. And let me tell you that, there are so many
similarities.
No, not just similarities. It is much more so at this point in time.
Yes.
So that's it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Rabia. I should now move to Ms. Aiden to answer the questions related to the Uyghur Muslims, basically. And let me introduce Ms. Aiden. She is an activist. She is a Uyghur American, Uyghur Muslim American, and she's an activist in a number of platforms, including that her relatives, already 90 of them, has been missed due to the surveillance that the Chinese government have done. She is already in a number of campaigns, basically campaigning for to save the Uyghur Muslims. She holds a bachelor degree in the field of arts, comparative studies from University of Duke. Ms. Aiden, I welcome you here, and we are very pleased to have you here with us. There are a number of questions related to the Uyghur issue coming from the audience. In the case of the Uyghur Muslims, as we know, the Western governments have, if you see the trade relationships, if you see the interests of the Western governments, modern democratic countries, including even Muslim majority countries who represent the OIC, why they should basically stand up for the rights and stand up for basically against China while they have this great interests. I mean, as you can see, today's world is based on interests basically, and of course this is affecting the campaigns really to bring the attention, especially in the between the Muslim majority countries. If you take Saudi Arabia, if you take Turkey, if you take Pakistan, other countries who have already strategic relationships, trade relationships, trade balances, and so on. What is going to make them really shift and change their mind and be with the Uyghur Muslims? That's the question number one. And question number two, in your opinion, what is the long-term solution for the Uyghur Muslims? Of course, this question goes for the rest of the cases, that we have really discussed today, Kashmir or the Rohingya Muslims. But in your opinion, what could be the long-term solution for the Uyghur Muslims? The floor is yours, Ms. Aiden.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys for having me. To address your first question, I would say that's a very big question. Is what exactly does it take to convince a government that is so economically dependent and strategically tied to China to speak up against what China is doing? And they are committing an active genocide with the largest concentration camp system present since Nazi Germany. I would say that it's definitely a difficult question for me to answer with, because there's no one right answer, but why should they speak up? It's because this is a urgent, very urgent human rights issue. This is not really a political issue. It's about really saving people who are undergoing a genocide. And so by being using the excuse of being tied to China economically, you are being fully complicit in this genocide. And to say that, obviously these countries have their hands tied, well, I think there are ways that, countries can try to at least bring up the issue in maybe a more diplomatic way, or not completely ignore it. There have been Muslim majority countries that have actually signed letters supporting what China is doing, claiming that they are supporting these China's counterterrorism measures. Saudi Arabia is one of them, for example. Or even if they don't sign on to these documents or sign on to these letters explicitly supporting what China is doing, they are actively taking China's financial support into their hands. And for me, coming from a more I think Islamic perspective, you're not going to get, and the whole idea is, about protecting your country's economy, that you have to protect the interests of your own people. So if China's money is being used to uplift your economy, honestly, that's blood money. That's haram money. So I don't think there's any kind of barakah that comes out of that. So I think that's something that these countries should keep in mind. And then also that China is actually slowly infiltrating different parts of the world. It's not just the people of East Turkestan that are going through this oppression. The East Turkestan is actually, that whole region is just a guinea pig. It serves as a guinea pig for policies that it has been slowly enacting in other parts of, China as well. And now you're starting to see forms of colonialism and neo-colonialism in places like Pakistan, and even with the One Belt One Road initiative, which, if for those who don't know, I encourage you guys to look this up. But they're using this initiative, multi-trillion-dollar initiative, to really make these countries even more dependent on China. We're starting to see like Han settlers going into parts of Pakistan, and I remember a couple of Pakistani friends were telling me how certain parts are just of Pakistan that they, were visiting had only Chinese signs up. So we're starting to see this and even Turkey, now the international airport apparently has signs where it's written in Turkish and English, but then also Chinese translation. You had public transport signs also be written in Turkish as well. In Chinese as well. So you can start to see the slow infiltration that China is really trying to exert into different parts of the world. China wants to make sure that they are considered the center of the world in any way possible. And so I really urge, countries to be very wary about their relationships, not just because it's the wrong, not just because it takes you into the wrong direction by being fully complicit in this genocide, but also because they may regret it later. And then to address your second question regarding, long-term solutions. So this is definitely a question that I would say there might be some arguments of difference of opinion in terms of what is the long-term solution. Some people might say that the long-term solution is China has to guarantee human rights and, free these people in the camps. But I would argue that the solution is much more nuanced and complicated than that. I think one thing that people forget is that we're an occupied territory, just like Kashmir, just like Palestine. We've been occupied since 1940, and barely anybody frames it as an occupation. And so when you look at the core root of a lot of the the ethnic tensions that that have happened between Uyghur and Han Chinese people, it's all stemming from being frustrated with the occupation, the effects of the occupation. People frame Uyghurs as ethnic minorities of China, which is honestly very cringeworthy, because it really it makes people think that we're just part of China. We're just this, we're just this Turkic, exotic ethnic group in the northwest part of China. But in reality, we're just another Turkic population with a land, a super large land size have been occupied. We've been living under the effects of those, undergoing forms of genocide and ethnic cleansing. Yet people don't talk about this. So my take on the long-term solution would be really asserting independence, reasserting independence. I would like to say, not asserting as if we didn't have it before. We had lived with independence beforehand, but asserting that independence, taking our occupied land back, and ensuring that this occupation no longer takes place. People may argue that this may not be the smartest move strategically. They may say that that may cause China to push back even more, to cause us to suffer even more. But if we want to look at it at a more black and white perspective, with just generally the whole situation, the occupation, independence is the way to go. But people may argue that, again, this may cause further backlash, further oppression. So let's do one thing at a time. For example, let's just focus on having people released from these camps. Let's focus on having freedom of religion, freedom from surveillance. So it's a bit nuanced, but at this point, with the overall trauma that is taking place in the East Turkestani community, I don't think that even people being released at this very moment is going to cause people to be okay. I think people have already been psychologically, physically damaged from this genocide, that there is no turning back. The damage has already been done. Intergenerational trauma has already been done. Forced sterilization, has already been done, to the point where in the past 2 years, the birth rates of people in East Turkestan have decreased by 50%. So, the damage has already been done. So if anything, if people are released from these camps right now, it won't, I think China claims that they're trying to get rid of radicalism and extremism, but if anything, this may cause more backlash.
Ms. Aydin, just to come back to you, I mean, part of what some people say when they basically see the Americans and some European countries now getting up and talking about the genocide and talking about what's happening, and we know that unfortunately there are some other Muslim kind of situations, like the case of Palestine, for example, and sometimes using fake bases to invade like a country like Iraq, for example, the weapons of mass destructions and others. Now, the intentions of those countries, or the interests, if I may, of those countries who are like criticizing China, there is an audience who cannot believe because they know previously that these countries did not get up for Muslims, and there are Muslims who have already pleased and crisis and conflicts without solution. The case of Kashmir, the case of Palestine, in addition to many other cases. Now, for some people who feel like or see that this is a propaganda, and the West is now making like this jump or this shift or change because there is like a competition, and they are using basically the Uyghur issue to push back China. How do you respond to such an issue? Of course, in short, please, because we don't have much time, and we need to ask the others as well. Another question to Professor Rabia is, why Pakistan, who has this case of Kashmir, is basically silent against what China is doing to the Uyghurs, basically? Why there is this kind of silence? Why we don't hear from Pakistan a vocal position supporting the Uyghur Muslims? They are just their neighbor. Is it a strategic alliance? Is it a strategic kind of relationships because of the Godar, the Silk Way and the Belt kind of Chinese globalization brand? Is it for that, or what else? These are the two questions to you. And at the same time, I would like to bring as well Professor Zarni regarding the Uyghur Muslims in light of the recent situation, the recent, coup in basically against the elections results and so on. What do you think is going to take place? What's going to happen basically while we see there is an unrest against what has happened by the military? These three questions to the three speakers, and please give me as well some time, because I have to conclude by 7:40. I have to ask as well Professor Farid, if you can answer as quick as possible, 1 minute each question. Professor, sorry, Aydin, can you start and then answer in 1 minute? Then we can go to Professor Rabia, then Professor Zarni.
So my quick answer to your question about how to deal with the idea of Western propaganda, genocide deniers. My quick response to that is, okay, let's say you don't want to believe BBC or CNN or what is deemed as quote unquote Western propaganda. In that case, how about you listen to the oppressed people themselves? Mm-hmm. There are numerous Uyghur people in diaspora who have been speaking out about their missing family members, about their time in prison, Chinese prison, or their time in these concentration camps. There are, now more and more camp survivors coming out. And the reason why these people are able to be released from these concentration camps in the first place is because oftentimes they're actually citizens of another government that have vouched for their release. So we have multiple testimonies that have come out about the horrors that they have faced in these camps. We have one camp survivor in Virginia, for example. Her name is Mehrigul Tursun. She was an Egyptian also. In addition to being a citizen of China, she was also a citizen of Egypt. And so the Egyptian government vouched for her release. She got released. She comes here to the United States, and the US doctor tells her she has been sterilized. She cannot have kids anymore. This happens to her in her 3 months of detention. So listen to the story of those oppressed. Oftentimes in human rights discourse, if they would, people will I think try to push back against human rights discourse and say, oh, testimony is not legitimate form of evidence, but a human rights discourse, it is that you have to listen to the stories. And beyond that, beyond testimonies, there's also satellite imagery, Google satellite imagery that shows the construction of these camps. There are actually journalists who have entered this region in a more covert way so they wouldn't get caught, and you can see the surveillance system playing in front of you. And also, one more thing, the Chinese government has actually admitted most of their crimes. There was a tweet by the Chinese embassy a couple months ago calling Uyghur women baby making machines, saying, guess what? They're no longer baby making machines, and we're actually promoting gender equality by doing so. So they admitted that they're forcibly sterilizing Uyghur women in camps and prisons.
Thank you.
So that's my response to that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good answers. Thank you very much. Let me move to Professor Rabia to my question regarding the Pakistani position and what is happening and taking place to the Uyghur Muslims, and this strategic relationship between Pakistan and China in relation to the Silk Way and the Belt, the virgin of globalization of China. Yes, please. The microphone is yours. In 1 minute, please.
Yeah, thank you, sir. The thing is that I would talk from the standpoint of literature, since I am a student of literature. This is something which a political analyst would answer you better. However, what I would say is that it is the Kashmiris, when they started writing, it is only then when the Palestinians, they had started writing very, very early on, whereas Kashmiris had started quite late in the day. However, it is the writing which is making the world aware of all the problems. And I'm sure that Uyghur Muslims and the Rohingya Muslims, in fact, I will look for their works also so that I can add it into my, knowledge as well.
Thank you very much.
So,
thank you, Professor. Thank you for this. I moved to Professor Zarni, basically, and my question was, how do you see the future of the Rohingya Muslims in light of the recent developments and the unrest that has taken place in Myanmar? And of course, some of the things you can comment on, the interests of the modern democratic countries and so on, and Muslim majority countries who have like interests with the Myanmar government and being silent regarding the Rohingya case. Please, Professor Zarni, the microphone is yours.
Well, I think, because there's a seismic shift in public sentiments, favorably re-embracing Rohingyas as our own people, the plight of the Rohingya becomes reintegrated to the larger national politics. And so what happens to, the country as a whole will have either negative or positive consequences for the Rohingya. Repatriation, the biggest hurdle for repatriation of 1 million Rohingya from Bangladesh has been removed because it's the public opinion. And so both Aung San Suu Kyi's previous government and the primary genocidal regime of military, they have played politics with Rohingya. And so, the public will no longer be fooled by whichever party comes back to power. But the most worrying thing is, for the country as a whole, I really do not see a happy ending with what's happening, because what we have is the state actor, or at least like supposedly state actor, national armed forces that control air force, infantry, and Navy morphing into terroristic organizations. So we are looking at essentially a civil war situation, and Rohingya is going to be caught in there as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Zarni, for this elaboration. Let me go to Professor Farid in the coming 3 minutes. Professor Farid, I have like a couple of questions or 3 questions related to what is the way forward in Europe from academics, media, government, and Muslim communities who is responsible party or parties for the attack of free speech and Islamophobia policies and measures attacks on free speech, basically. That's question number one. And question number two, what is the relationship between the new term Islamo-leftism and Islamofascism and Muslim power? And last but not least, of course, there are universities who have Islamic studies in European universities, basically. Do they have anything to address issues of Islamophobia, racism, and so on, or these things were just part of decolonization studies and or post-colonization studies? As you rightly mentioned, there is as well some kind of rift between universities from the US, Canada, UK, with French universities, and this has been aired quite often in the recent years. Professor Farid, the floor is yours.
All right, that's kind of many questions, and I fear I won't be able to really address them.
You have 2 minutes, please. Yeah.
Okay, but let me say just a few things. I mean, first of all, I think many of the European nation states are currently following a strategy where they try to discipline the Muslim subject, and by that I mean they're trying, and that this endeavor comes primarily from the ministries of interior that are run by the idea that Muslims can pose a security threat to the society. So they are trying to modeling what they call a French, German, Dutch, whatever Islam, in order to make, like, create the good Muslim, which stands by the side of the state authorities. And some of these initiatives, especially in Germany, where this institutionalization of Islamic theology at state universities happened, are everything else but decolonial, but rather affirming the power structures that we can see there. So given that this is what we see from those who are in power, the question arises to what can those do on the other side? If we want to call it the 99% or the 90% and a few of their leaders. I am coming from, if you name it with an IR theory, I would say I'm coming more from the realistic paradigm. And if you want to ask me, very, very frankly speaking, what can be done? Power. Power is the only thing that these people understand. If we have no power, we have nothing to say. If we have power, and I'm not speaking as we only as scholars, we as Muslims, I'm speaking about the 99%. Okay? If these people get more power, then they will have more to say. So that in a very general way, I would say that's the answer. And
Thank
that
you.
has a lot of implications, obviously.
Thank you. Thank you so much for every one of you, the distinguished panelists. We will have like 15 minutes kind of a break, and then we will move to the next session. Hopefully it is about the alarming effects of the global war on terror. I'm very, very pleased to be with you today, and I really thank you for this excellent interventions and presentations from your side. Thank you. Have a great time. Bye.
Thank you.